In 1944, the Allied forces faced a challenge that tested the limits of aviation, technology, and human endurance. Far beyond the front lines of Europe, deep in enemy territory lay critical industrial centers that powered the Nazi war machine. Factories producing aircraft, tanks, and munitions were heavily fortified and far beyond the range of conventional bombers. To strike these targets required ingenuity, precision, and machines built for endurance, unlike anything previously flown. The B-29 Superfortress had emerged as the answer. Larger than any Allied bomber before it, with 4 powerful engines, pressurized cabins, and the ability to carry massive bomb loads across thousands of miles, it was the pinnacle of wartime aviation engineering. Yet even this aircraft would face an unprecedented challenge: a bombing run covering 3,000 miles to strike a target deep within enemy territory. Planning such a mission demanded meticulous attention to every variable. Weather patterns had to be studied across continents, from the takeoff airfield to the target zone. Engineers analyzed fuel consumption, payload weight, and engine performance under sustained stress. Navigators calculated routes over oceans, mountains, and desert terrain, ensuring that crews would maintain position even when landmarks were hidden and clouds obscured sight lines. Every decision, from altitude to formation flying, could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. Inside the briefing rooms, commanders and aircrew studied maps and aerial photographs, noting every enemy installation, radar site, and anti-aircraft battery along the route. Flight paths were chosen to minimize exposure while maximizing bombing accuracy. Radio communication protocols were rehearsed, contingency plans for mechanical failure or enemy interception were devised, and crews were drilled in emergency procedures that might never be used, but if needed, would be the difference between life and death. For the men who would fly these missions, preparation was as much psychological as it was technical. They were trained to endure long periods of monotony and tension, to remain alert for sudden danger, and to perform every action with precision under extreme fatigue. Every crew member understood that this was not a routine flight. The sheer distance alone would push human endurance to its limits.
Engineers and mechanics worked tirelessly to ensure that each B-29 was in peak condition. Fuel lines, engines, navigation instruments, and bomb release mechanisms were checked repeatedly. Crews walked around their aircraft, performing final inspections, testing instruments, and mentally rehearsing every phase of the journey. This combination of machine reliability and human discipline would be critical in the days ahead. The mission plan called for a round-trip flight exceeding 3,000 miles, crossing oceans, hostile airspace, and heavily defended regions. Crews would be in the air for hours without relief, navigating by instruments and celestial cues, constantly monitoring fuel levels and aircraft performance. The danger was omnipresent. Storms could strike unexpectedly, engines could fail, enemy fighters could appear, and anti-aircraft fire could erupt at any moment. Each decision in the cockpit was amplified by distance and consequence. The payload was carefully calculated for maximum impact. Bomb aimers studied photographs and blueprints of enemy facilities, learning every detail of the factories, railways, and fuel depots that they were tasked to destroy. The goal was not merely destruction, but precision. Missed targets would waste thousands of miles of effort and could expose the bombers to unnecessary danger during extended loitering or reapproach maneuvers. Crew assignments were finalized. Pilots and co-pilots, navigators, bombardiers, flight engineers, radio operators, and gunners all had specific roles with no margin for error. The success of the mission depended on each man performing his role flawlessly for the entire duration of the flight under conditions that would test nerves, skill, and endurance to the extreme. Months of training had prepared the crews for these conditions. Simulated long-distance flights, navigation exercises, bombing drills, and emergency protocols ensured that every man knew what to do in every conceivable scenario. But no training could replicate the isolation, fatigue, and pressure of flying thousands of miles over hostile territory, knowing that a single miscalculation could be fatal. As the day of the mission approached, tension mounted. The airfields buzzed with activity. Ground crews completed final inspections, refueling and arming the bombers. Crews gathered for last briefings, discussing routes, enemy positions, and weather reports. Pilots visualized their flight paths, bombardiers reviewed target layouts, and gunners checked their weapons. The enormity of the mission weighed on every mind. Yet amid the tension, a quiet resolve emerged. These were men trained for precision, disciplined by experience, and driven by a sense of purpose. They knew that success would not come from luck, but from skill, endurance, and cohesion. Every mile flown, every calculation made, and every decision taken would contribute to the outcome of a mission unlike any other in the history of aerial warfare.
Finally, as dusk approached, the engines roared to life. The B-29s, symbols of human ingenuity and mechanical mastery, prepared to lift into the night sky. The crews, focused and resolute, assumed their stations. Ahead lay 3,000 miles of uncertainty, danger, and exhaustion. Behind them lay the safety of home. Between the two stretched the longest bombing run in history, a mission that would test the limits of machines and men alike. The first steps of this monumental journey had begun. Every takeoff, every mile, and every calculation would matter. The world would soon witness the endurance, skill, and courage required to accomplish a feat that no human or machine had attempted before. The flight begins. As darkness settled over the airfield, the B-29 Superfortresses lifted into the night sky, their massive frames casting long shadows across the tarmac. Engines hummed with relentless power, and the vibrations ran through every crew member's body. This was no ordinary mission. Over 3,000 miles stretched before them, a path filled with uncertainty, danger, and unrelenting demands on human endurance. Pilots guided their aircraft with meticulous care, ensuring perfect alignment for formation takeoff. Each plane carried a carefully calculated payload, the weight of which would influence speed, fuel consumption, and altitude. Co-pilots monitored instruments, scanning for any anomalies in engine performance, hydraulics, or fuel flow. The engineers adjusted throttle settings, keeping a constant watch over temperatures and pressures that, if mismanaged, could spell disaster thousands of miles from home. Navigation began immediately, for every mile mattered. Over vast oceans, there were no roads, no towns, no lights to guide them. Celestial navigation, radar readings, and calculated dead reckoning became their lifeline. The navigators' charts were marked with meticulous detail, distances, expected drift due to wind, course corrections for potential storms. Every hour of flight required attention, yet the monotony of hours spent staring at instruments, skies, and clouds added a psychological strain, almost as severe as physical fatigue. Inside the cockpits, silence was punctuated only by the low hum of engines, the occasional radio report, and the occasional murmured calculation. Crew members rotated between tasks, bombardiers scanning charts, radio operators listening for updates, gunners on high alert, each performing their duties with precision. Any lapse could compromise not only the success of the mission, but the survival of the crew.
The vastness of the ocean beneath was both awe-inspiring and unnerving. Waves glimmered faintly in moonlight, while clouds drifted silently above, hiding landmarks and occasionally forming turbulent pockets of air. Every mile flown required vigilance. Fuel consumption was monitored relentlessly, as even a small miscalculation could leave a bomber stranded hundreds of miles from any friendly airfield. The aircraft were marvels of engineering, yet they were machines that demanded respect, care, and constant attention. Hours passed and the night deepened. Crew members fought off fatigue with small rituals, checking instruments, reading coordinates, and occasionally glancing at the vast sky beyond the cockpit windows. The monotony was punctuated by brief bursts of tension, distant lightning from storms, unexpected cloud turbulence, or the occasional glimpse of a navigation beacon on a remote island far below. These small markers offered reassurance, a sense of progress through a seemingly endless expanse. The B-29's unique design allowed for pressurized cabins, enabling crews to maintain consciousness at high altitudes. Yet the psychological strain of extended hours in tight quarters, with engines roaring and instruments demanding constant attention, was immense. The men were trained for endurance, but the reality of thousands of miles over hostile territory tested both nerve and skill. Every calculation, every adjustment of course, every glance at fuel gauges and altimeters was vital. Communication within the formation was constant. Pilots relayed position reports, navigators shared updates on drift, and commanders monitored the overall progress. The mission demanded flawless coordination. One miscalculation by any aircraft could force evasive maneuvers, disrupting formation and potentially exposing bombers to enemy detection or interception. Weather proved to be a persistent adversary. Storm systems over the ocean required minor adjustments, yet even these small corrections demanded careful attention. Winds could push aircraft off course, cloud cover could obscure navigation markers, and turbulence could unsettle even the most experienced crew. Pilots adjusted throttle settings and altitude, while navigators recalculated headings in real time. These tasks, repeated hour after hour, were mentally exhausting, but essential for survival and mission success.
As dawn approached over the distant horizon, the first signs of land appeared. Tiny specks of islands and coastal features emerged beneath the clouds. For the crew, it was a bittersweet moment, a glimpse of progress, yet a reminder that enemy territory was near. The final leg of the outward journey demanded heightened vigilance. Anti-aircraft defenses would soon come into range, and any mistake could be deadly. Every crew member was acutely aware of the stakes. Bombardiers double-checked their equipment and recalculated bombing solutions based on altitude, wind, and distance. Gunners scanned the skies for enemy fighters, ready to defend the aircraft with precision. Pilots maintained formation with unwavering focus, mindful that even minor deviations could have catastrophic consequences. For many, the physical demands were immense. Long hours of sitting, constant tension in muscles, and the need to maintain focus despite fatigue pushed the body to its limits. Yet the training, discipline, and cohesion of the crew allowed them to persevere. Each man relied on the others, navigator, pilot, bombardier, engineer, and gunner alike, trusting in shared skill and shared purpose. As the sun began to rise over distant coastlines, the first traces of enemy defenses appeared. Radar pings, observation posts, and early warning signals signaled the transition from endurance flight to combat alert. The crews had flown thousands of miles, yet the mission's greatest challenges were now ahead: penetrating enemy defenses, delivering the payload, and surviving the return journey. The first leg of the longest bombing run in history had been completed, and already the men understood the magnitude of what they had undertaken. This was more than a bombing mission. It was a test of human perseverance, technical skill, and the limits of endurance. For the crew of each B-29, every mile flown, every calculation made, and every adjustment taken was a triumph over uncertainty, fatigue, and danger. The horizon ahead was dark with promise and peril. Enemy territory awaited, defenses bristled, and the ultimate objective loomed hundreds of miles away. Yet the crews remained focused, disciplined, and determined.
They were bound by training, camaraderie, and an understanding that success depended on the flawless execution of each member's role.
The flight continued, hour after hour, as the sun climbed, illuminating distant coastlines and marking progress across the vast expanse. Every mile brought them closer to the target, yet also deeper into risk. Fatigue pressed harder, instruments demanded constant attention, and enemy detection was a persistent threat. Yet the crews pressed on, propelled by duty, courage, and a mission that would go down in history. And so the longest bombing run continued, a journey defined by endurance, precision, and human determination. A flight that would test every limit, challenge every skill, and leave an indelible mark on the history of warfare. After countless hours over oceans, mountains, and isolated terrain, the B-29 crews finally approached enemy territory. The first signs were subtle: a radar blip here, a searchlight flickering in the distance, a faint trail of smoke from an observation post. What had been abstract danger during the long flight now became tangible, immediate, and deadly. Pilots adjusted altitude and heading, balancing the need for accuracy with the imperative to avoid anti-aircraft defenses. Every inch of airspace was contested. Every movement could be observed, tracked, and targeted. Flight engineers monitored engine performance with relentless attention, knowing that failure so far from friendly bases could be fatal. Bombardiers checked instruments repeatedly, recalculating trajectories and adjusting for wind, altitude, and drift. Every number mattered. The first bursts of flak erupted ahead, brilliant sparks lighting the darkened sky. The initial shock hit the crews simultaneously. The distant threat of enemy fire was now reality. Gunners manned their stations, scanning the horizon for fighters. Radio operators relayed reports of radar detection, confirming the approach of anti-aircraft batteries. Pilots navigated through a deadly gauntlet of defenses. Anti-aircraft fire painted the sky with bursts of white and orange, while searchlights cut jagged lines through darkness. Each B-29 maintained formation as best as possible, but the tension was palpable. Even slight deviations in course could bring a bomber into the line of fire, potentially destroying the aircraft. Inside the cockpit, crew members were focused but tense. Bombardiers hunched over sighting devices, calculating release points with unwavering precision. Navigators double-checked headings, accounting for wind drift and enemy movements. Flight engineers monitored gauges for signs of overheating or fuel depletion. The smallest error could be catastrophic. Hours of long flight, monotony, and mental strain converged with immediate danger. Fatigue threatened to cloud judgment, but training and teamwork held it at bay. Each crew member relied on the others, pilot to co-pilot, navigator to bombardier, gunners to radio operators, creating a fragile but unbreakable chain of precision and trust. Finally, the first targets emerged: sprawling industrial complexes, factories belching smoke, rail yards crisscrossing the terrain, and storage depots bristling with munitions. The bombardiers adjusted sights, recalculating trajectories in real time. Pilots aligned the aircraft carefully, threading through bursts of flak while maintaining optimal altitude and speed. Every second mattered. Bombs were released with exacting precision. The first impact shook the earth below. Factories were destroyed or set ablaze, storage depots erupted in fireballs, and rail lines were severed. The crews watched as months of planning culminated in tangible destruction. The moment was electrifying, yet no one allowed themselves relief. They were still exposed to danger. Enemy fighters began to appear, silhouetted against fires below or emerging from cloud cover. Gunners opened fire, creating a defensive perimeter around the bombers. Pilots performed evasive maneuvers while maintaining formation, an intricate dance of survival and duty.
Every movement was critical, every shot calculated. Despite the chaos, the bombing run continued. Targets were engaged in sequence, with crews adjusting for smoke, wind, and the unpredictability of explosions. The precision of the B-29, combined with meticulous planning and the skill of the men aboard, ensured maximum impact. The industrial heart of the enemy, once thought unreachable, was now within the grasp of Allied forces. As bombs fell, fires raged across factories, warehouses, and fuel depots. The heat of explosions rose in towering columns of smoke, visible even from thousands of feet above. Crew members observed the devastation with a mixture of awe and grim satisfaction. This was the objective they had trained for, the culmination of months of preparation, thousands of miles of flight, and the testing of every skill and nerve.
Yet danger was far from over. Flak continued to burst around the aircraft, and fighters circled in intermittent attacks. Pilots remained vigilant, adjusting altitude and course to minimize exposure. Bombardiers, gunners, and navigators worked in tandem, each action synchronized to protect both the mission and the men aboard. Time became an abstract measure. Hours passed with precision maneuvers, calculations, and bursts of anti-aircraft fire. Crews rotated attention between instruments, the horizon, and enemy activity, often performing multiple roles simultaneously. Fatigue pressed heavily, but training and discipline allowed each man to endure. Finally, the last bombs were released. The primary targets were engaged, fires raged, and the industrial complexes were crippled. Yet the mission was only half complete. The return journey loomed, equally perilous and demanding. Every crew member understood that survival depended on maintaining focus, managing fatigue, and navigating back across thousands of miles of hostile airspace. As the B-29s climbed to safer altitudes and set course for home, crews began the mental shift from attack to endurance. Instruments were rechecked, fuel monitored, and the aircraft formation re-established. The outward leg of the mission had tested skill, courage, and precision. The return flight would test endurance, resilience, and sheer willpower. The enemy territory receded behind them, smoke and fire marking the impact of the raid. Yet the danger remained. Flak batteries were still active, enemy fighters could intercept, and storms threatened to push the bombers off course. The men were exhausted but vigilant, acutely aware that one lapse could undo all that had been achieved. Through the long hours, a profound sense of accomplishment mixed with weariness. They had penetrated deep into hostile territory, faced the full spectrum of danger, and executed the most precise bombing raid of their careers. Yet the journey was not yet complete. Every mile back toward Allied bases would demand the same skill, vigilance, and courage as the attack itself. And so, with targets behind them and a 1,500-mile journey still ahead, the crews of the longest bombing run pressed on. They had made history, but survival remained paramount. Each man understood that endurance, precision, and human determination were as vital on the way back as they had been on the approach. The mission had entered its final phase, the grueling, relentless flight home. For the B-29s and their crews, the longest bombing run in history was only halfway complete, and the true test of human endurance was just beginning. With the roar of explosions fading into the distance, the B-29 crews began the longest stretch of the mission, the journey home. The outward flight had tested skill, precision, and courage. The bombing itself had demonstrated planning, execution, and ingenuity. Yet now, as the aircraft turned their noses toward friendly territory, another challenge awaited, one that would push men and machines to the very limits of endurance. Fatigue weighed heavily on every crew member. Hours upon hours in cramped, pressurized cabins had drained physical energy and frayed nerves. Pilots had maintained constant vigilance, their hands steady on controls despite trembling muscles and weary eyes. Bombardiers had hunched over sighting devices, calculating trajectories in near darkness, while gunners had scanned the horizon relentlessly, ready for threats that might never appear.
Yet the return flight demanded renewed focus. Any lapse in navigation could carry a bomber hundreds of miles off course, leaving it stranded over hostile or open terrain with dwindling fuel. Crew members rotated tasks as best they could, but the monotony of long hours, combined with exhaustion, required extraordinary discipline. Each man relied not only on his own endurance, but on the skill, vigilance, and support of those around him. Mechanical strain became an ever-present concern. Engines had run at high power for hours. Fuel lines, hydraulics, and navigational instruments were taxed. Flight engineers monitored temperatures, pressures, and gauges, ready to troubleshoot any anomaly. Even minor mechanical issues had the potential to escalate into life-threatening emergencies when far from any airfield.
Storms compounded the challenge. Thick cloud cover, turbulent air, and high winds tested both aircraft stability and navigational skill. Pilots adjusted altitude, banking against gusts and turbulence, while navigators recalculated headings in real time. Lightning illuminated distant clouds, offering both guidance and a reminder of nature's raw power. Every decision, every adjustment had consequences measured in miles, fuel, and survival. The psychological toll was immense. Isolation over vast oceans or mountainous terrain magnified the sense of danger. Crew members could see nothing beyond the endless sky and occasional horizon line. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously. Fatigue blurred the edges of perception, and yet the men pressed on, disciplined by training and bound by the shared responsibility of survival. Enemy threats were still present, though less intense than on the approach. Fighter patrols occasionally appeared, probing the formation for weakness. Anti-aircraft fire erupted sporadically, bursts of orange and white tracing arcs in the sky. Pilots executed evasive maneuvers with precision, while gunners engaged the attackers with disciplined accuracy. Coordination within the formation was paramount, and each successful defense was a testament to training, skill, and teamwork. Navigational challenges intensified during the return journey. Celestial cues shifted as night approached, and weather patterns obscured landmarks. Dead reckoning became the primary method, supplemented by radio signals and intermittent visual markers. One miscalculation could result in hours of deviation, placing aircraft at risk of running out of fuel before reaching safety. Navigators double-checked every calculation, cross-referenced instruments, and remained vigilant despite exhaustion. As the hours dragged on, the monotony and tension created a unique psychological environment. Men alternated between moments of hyper-focus and stretches of mental fatigue where perception slowed. Pilots, bombardiers, and navigators relied on subtle cues, practiced routines, and a shared understanding of procedures to maintain accuracy. Even the simplest adjustments, engine throttle, heading correction, or communication, required conscious attention and unwavering discipline. Fuel management became critical. Consumption rates were calculated meticulously, with engineers and pilots monitoring every pound. Any miscalculation could result in a forced ditching over hostile territory or open ocean. The weight of responsibility was felt by all. One minor error could imperil hundreds of miles of effort, risking the lives of the entire crew.